Hi everyone, let's discuss about ventricles of brain. So there are four ventricles within the brain. They are present at the center of the brain and they contain cerebrospinal fluid CSF. They are actually irregular shaped cavities within the brain. Yep. Irregular shaped cavities, and these ventricles of the brain are lateral ventricles. There are right lateral ventricle and left lateral ventricle, third ventricle and the fourth ventricle. तो ऐसे चार वेंट्रिकल्स हैं और उस इन वेंट्रिकल्स के अंदर एक फ्लूइड है, उसे सेरेब्रोस्पाइनल फ्लूइड कहते हैं या सीएसएफ. इर्रेगुलर शेप्ड कैविटीज़ है ये ब्रेन के अंदर, ब्रेन के सेंटर में इर्रेगुलर शेप्ड कैविटीज़. एंड इन वेंट्रिकल्स में मेनली फोर वेंट्रिकल्स है एंड उन फोर वेंट्रिकल का नाम है राइट लैटरल वेंट्रिकल, लेफ्ट लैटरल वेंट्रिकल, थर्ड वेंट्रिकल एंड फोर्थ वेंट्रिकल. ये डायग्राम है जिसमें ये आप साइड्स में देख रहा है एंड दीज आर लैटरल वेंट्रिकल्स. देन उसके नीचे है यहाँ दे आर थर्ड वेंट्रिकल एंड उसके नीचे जो ये वेंट्रिकल्स है दे आर फोर्थ वेंट्रिकल. Okay, so two lateral ventricles, one on the left, one on the right, and third ventricle, then the fourth ventricle. There are four irregular shaped cavities which is filled with cerebrospinal fluid, and they are ventricles. Let's discuss about the lateral ventricles. They are present one on each side of the cerebral hemisphere. Cerebral hemisphere के दोनों साइड में एक एक है. And they are present below the corpus callosum. Corpus callosum के नीचे है. See the cerebral hemisphere. So the right and the left cerebral hemisphere, so divided at the center by a longitudinal fissure which divides the cerebrum into right cerebral hemisphere and the left cerebral hemisphere, and which is being connected by a group of nerve fiber, and they are called corpus callosum. Corpus callosum. And these ventricles are present below the corpus callosum, and there are left lateral ventricle and right lateral ventricle. So ये cerebral hemisphere में एक एक है, एक cerebral hemisphere में एक और दूसरे cerebral hemisphere में दूसरा. So right side में right lateral ventricle और left cerebral hemisphere में left lateral ventricle. एंड ये दोनों कॉर्पस कलोसम के नीचे है. एंड यहाँ पे मोर क्लियर डायग्राम है. सो दिस वन इज द लेफ्ट लैटरल वेंट्रिकल एंड दिस इज द राइट लैटरल वेंट्रिकल, एंड एट इट्स सेंटर बिलो टू दैट इज द थर्ड वेंट्रिकल. दिस इज द थर्ड वेंट्रिकल एंड बिलो दैट इज द फोर्थ वेंट्रिकल. So if you divide the cerebral hemisphere into two, the right cerebral hemisphere, this is the left cerebral hemisphere, and they are present one on each side of the cerebral hemisphere. Okay, so cerebrospinal fluid CSF drains into the third ventricle from the lateral ventricles. From the right and the left lateral ventricle, the cerebrospinal fluid drains into the third ventricle and through a foramen called interventricular foramen. That foramen is called interventricular foramen. This foramen, through which it drains into the CSF, drains into the third ventricle, and that foramen is called interventricular foramen. Interventricular foramen. Then now we'll discuss about the third ventricle. This is present below the lateral ventricle. Lateral ventricles के नीचे है. And cerebral aqueduct is the canal that connects the third ventricle with the fourth ventricle. Third ventricle और fourth ventricle को connect करने वाले जो canal है, and that is cerebral aqueduct. You can see that here. This is a canal that connects the third ventricle with the fourth ventricle, and that is cerebral aqueduct. Okay, let's discuss about the fourth ventricle now. This is a diamond-shaped cavity, a diamond-shaped structure. This is roughly diamond-shaped. This fourth ventricle is roughly diamond-shaped, and this is present below the third ventricle. This is present. This is the third ventricle, and this fourth ventricle is present below the third ventricle, and it lies between pons and the cerebellum. This lies between the pons. In front there is pons, and to its back there is cerebellum. So this is present between the pons in front and cerebellum at the back. Then cerebrospinal fluid from the third ventricle drains through, as we discussed earlier. CSF from the third ventricle is drained through the cerebral aqueduct, as we discussed earlier. From the third ventricle, it is drained. CSF is drained into the fourth ventricle through cerebral aqueduct. On the roof of the fourth ventricle, there are foramen holes at the roof of the fourth ventricle, and they allow the cerebrospinal fluid to enter into the subarachnoid space. And those foramen are called lateral aperture. So you can see that here, lateral aperture on the roof of the fourth ventricle that allow the CSF to drain into the subarachnoid space. So they are called lateral aperture. And fourth ventricle continues as a central canal of the spinal cord. So it continues as the central canal of the spinal cord. So you can see that here. This is the central canal of the spinal cord that runs all along the length of the spinal cord. So that continues as the central canal, of the spinal cord. And the foramen at the distal end of the central canal allow the flow of cerebrospinal fluid into the subarachnoid space of the spinal cord. So the central canal, which runs through the middle of the spinal cord, and it opens at the tip. There is an opening at the tip that allows the cerebrospinal fluid again to enter into the subarachnoid space. So ये सेंट्रल कनाल है, एंड नीचे जाके स्पाइनल कॉर्ड के एंड पे ओपनिंग है, जिससे CSF जो cerebrospinal fluid subarachnoid space में फिर से चले जाएंगे. तो that's all about the ventricles of the brain. These ventricles are irregular shaped cavities and present within the brain. And their function is to secrete CSF. There are choroid plexuses present within the ventricles of the brain, and these choroid plexuses, they secrete cerebrospinal fluid, and this cerebrospinal fluid will flow into the subarachnoid space, and this subarachnoid space within the subarachnoid space, cerebrospinal fluid flows, and which covers the whole brain and the spinal cord, and acting as a shock absorber or a cushion. So that's all about the ventricles of the brain. In that we discussed about right lateral ventricle, left lateral ventricle, third ventricle, and the fourth ventricle. I got you understood the points, and thank you for watching. Thank you very much.